You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the e-flux podcast. In this week's episode, Elvia Wilk talks to artist Agnieszka Kurant and researcher Tobias Rees about their overlapping interests and their collaboration in an AI working group.
So we're starting part 2 of our conversation with Agnieszka Kurant and Tobias Rees. We left it last time at this discussion of Agnieszka's work with termites as collaborators and also outsourced laborers, and the idea of artificial intelligence, which is a term from Jeff Bezos to refer to Amazon workers who are doing work that algorithms actually can't perform or that would be more expensive for algorithms to perform. So we're left with this idea of incomputability, what humans can do and what humans can't do, and whether or not that's a stable boundary or a stable dichotomy.
I want to come back with some critical or provocative questions, maybe. And that is an observation that I've made many times. People are very happy to question the human, but when it comes to the possibility of critique, they're not ready to sacrifice the human. So when we speak about society or politics, both terms, society and politics, are kind of anthropological concepts. They are concepts that define the human, right? The political is the opposite of the state of nature, and society is sort of the sociality of humans. It's a classical 19th century concept where Witte or Durkheim defined the human as social, and that is what sets humans apart from non-human beings. So I want to briefly tell you an episode, and it is I worked for a big public American research university, and we had conversations about how to reform the human sciences. And the dean of the social sciences asked me, Tobias, what is it that you really want to do? And I said, well, I want to reinvent the human sciences from scratch, like reinvent the human from scratch. And she says, that's crazy. And wants to get up. And I say, this is not crazy at all. It's megalomaniac. I completely understand that. And I have no illusions we will fail. But unless we begin somewhere, how do we move forward from here? We know that the human fails us. And what's your alternative? Last time we invented the human in the 1630s, it took well over 200 years. So let's not be too hard on us, but let's begin. She said, it was nice meeting you, and got up. So I tell this story because my interest in reinventing the human after the human, this general or universal concept that has made possible the humanities, humanism, humanity, even humanitarianism to some degree, and that undergirds all of the critical theories that we have at present. So this, if you really want to think after the human, then you have to expose all of this in its radicality. And so over time, I came up with two kinds of maps. One map is basically specific to the terms that we use to speak about the human. So you have on the one hand, human, subject, culture, civilization, poetry, politics, society, pretty much every term that we usually use to describe humans. And on the other hand, you have what? On the other hand, you usually have nature or machines. Okay. The second map makes a distinction between life and science. So life is the incomputable. Life is the irrational. Science is the computable and the rational. And you can play this through. You have the human, you have the machine, you have the living, you have the non-living, etc. And on the side of science, you usually also have capital, you have technology and engineering, you have computation, you have exploitation, you have control. So the whole critical vocabulary on which the humanities or human sciences, and there will be humanities and social sciences combined, rely is actually captured in that map. So if you now don't want to make the distinction between the computable and the incomputable, because whenever you make this distinction, you kind of operate with a juxtaposition where two things are mutually exclusive, and one is actually better than the other. So if you want to move beyond that, then what do? It seems in that moment as if you give up all critique, the possibility of critique. But is that actually the case? I don't think it is the case. It just means one has to learn to think differently. And there, you can easily think about the effort to come up with categories where the bionic and the abionic, or the computable and the incomputable, are linked to each other. So nonlinearity is not an obstacle maybe to computation, because of course nonlinearity is a mathematical concept. And what I find interesting about Agnieszka's work is that it provides, in its extreme, opportunities to think differently about life and science, or to think differently about the human.
Right, and picking up on this idea of the animal internet that she brought up in the previous episode, that's actually a project involving mapping as well, involving the way that maps of the world and of natural phenomena are created, and how the way that we map out time and space, harvesting information from natural resources and biological entities might change the way we think about our own role within those systems.
Yes, it's an interesting point, because one of the processes happening in the world that inspired my work is how the notion of mining changes, because we thought for centuries that mining only refers to geology. But in contemporary world, social capital becomes as important, if not more valuable than financial capital. And social capital, social energies are being mined on a par with other forms of energy. So the same way that oil or gas are extracted from the natural world, now social energies are extracted from the human realm with the use of algorithms. And I think that this is yet another example of this hybridization between geology and politics and AI, that mining of social energies and like the calculation of the aggregated value of social capital or of people power became almost comparable to other, like just became part of the energy market pretty much. And so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of like aggregated social capital and how it can be turned into form. And I started a couple of years ago with a series of works entitled The End of Signature, where I was aggregating signatures of various members of social movements or people supporting one cause, or, for example, members of a workers' union or employees of one institution, kind of continuing this thought from entomology that looks at termite mounds as collective personalities with distinct personality traits, and how we can look at social movements or even societies or different communities as having this distinct collective personalities. And so I evolved this collective signatures for various social movements and other groups. And more recently, I started thinking more about these questions of living and non-living beings, and how the questions of AI and genetic engineering and synthetic biology are changing our notions of what a living being is. And I thought a lot about this device called Tamagotchi that was invented in the 90s. And there were 76 million of Tamagotchis sold worldwide. So it's a nation's worth. And I was really interested in how this electronic pet, essentially, because Tamagotchis were just like egg-shaped pets that you could nourish, take for a walk, or cuddle. And they were actually exceptionally unattractive visually, which is very striking. And they always, the forms stayed pretty much the same over the years. And some Tamagotchis are still being sold. And I thought about the fact how maybe in contemporary world, when the notion of nature is changing and nature is being colonized. So we are starting to create this artificial environments such as animal internet. So what animal internet is, what scientists describe as animal internet, is this hybrid augmented reality that emerged when millions of people started following animals which are tagged with electronic devices around the world and following their migration, such as like following whales or flamingos or geese, and how they anticipate various phenomena such as tsunamis or earthquakes. But on the other hand, scientists started installing cameras in remote areas such as jungles or in the North Pole to film completely wild animals. And the animals are unaware of the fact that they are being filmed. But then the images from these cameras is broadcasted online, and millions of people are watching it. And not only that, they are also creating Facebook pages or fan pages for these animals and giving them names. So it produces this kind of augmented reality situation of hybridity between nature and culture and wilderness and AI that a lot of people started experiencing as nature, because a lot of people that don't want to go to the forest and are just experiencing nature in front of their computer screens, this is what nature started to be for them. So all this phenomena inspired me to realize the project called Animal Internet that we realized past spring at MIT. And so together with engineers and neuroscientists from various labs, we created an artificial animal, a kind of collective Tamagotchi of sorts, where in one instance we outsourced the behavior of this collective animal to workers of the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform. So we asked the workers around the globe to send us information how they feel at any given moment, if they are tired, angry, hungry, happy, or frustrated. And so we aggregated all these feelings into behavior of this animal that was an animatronic robotic mechanism covered with artificial fur and installed in like a kind of artificial nature habitat that we created at MIT. And it's a kind of a landscape, artificial landscape that looked very natural that we built for the webcam. And this aggregated energies of and information about like feelings from all these workers were powering the movements of this animal. And in a second separate aquarium, we created another artificial nature landscape that was a swarm of gerbils. And the behavior of the swarm, there were also consisted of animatronic gerbils covered with artificial fur, but looking very realistically in like a kind of desert steppe landscape, also filmed by a webcam. And the behavior of the swarm was a consequence of a Twitter scraper analysis or sentimental analysis of all the Twitter feeds of protest movements around the globe, which constantly evolve. And like this Twitter scraper performing a sentiment analysis of what each protest movement was at a given time, tweeting, whether it was, again, happiness, apathy, anger, frustration, and in this case, it translated to a collective behavior of the swarm. And after that, these two broadcasts, these two webcams were inserted among other thousands of other broadcasts and other webcams that are available online. So now, and they were not labeled as an art project. So now a lot of people who are watching the different animals are also following this artificial hybrid animals that are powered by people or outsourced to people. So it created this idea of future outsourced nature, which we are, I think, a lot of the questions that we're discussing with Tobias are precisely about that none of these categories are pure, that it's all mixed together. And when we think, for example, about the earliest uses of robotics to extend the use of limbs for humans, so for example, to create an artificial limb for patients who lost their arms and are connected to an artificial robotic limb, what it creates is a kind of hybrid situation of between human and machinic intelligence. And it cannot be reduced to any of these things, and it cannot be reduced to logic.
I'd like to move towards a semblance of a conclusion by zooming out, talking about the role of the artist, and specifically Tobias, because your very recent book, After Ethnos, is a rethinking of ethnographic fieldwork as the basis for anthropology, but also as the basis for a lot of thought and disciplines. How might you think about the role of fieldwork in relation to the idea of artistic research, which has been circulating for at least a decade as kind of a way of conceiving of practices like Agnieszka's, whether or not it's the appropriate term is up for debate?
Interesting. I'm not very good at one answer, so allow me to give you 2.5 or so. One is simply the recognition that ethnography and fieldwork within the discipline of cultural anthropology were really used as synonyms for most of the 20th century. To do fieldwork meant to study one ethnos, that is a sort of territorially imagined community that has a social structure, or that is a society that has a social structure, and this society has a culture, a way of endowing the world around it with meaning or using its social structure to order the natural world around it. So you also have this distinction between the human on the one hand and nature on the other hand. And maybe in the 1980s and 90s, with globalization and hybridization, etc., this began to break open, and Padurai is maybe one of the most famous examples for this. People tracked how sort of cosmopolitan cultures emerged, but ultimately that was still completely indebted to this classical concept of the ethnos, i.e. a territory, a social structure, a culture, because what now happens is that people from different cultural backgrounds mix, but the way they mix is either informed by where they come from, i.e. we still hold on to this, or they form new kinds of cultures. So it is completely indebted to the old model. And when I tried to think through how one could leave that behind, so I basically got bored by this. You can repeat it over and over again, and there might be mild modifications in social structure. You might find different kinds of meaning, but actually the sort of Cartesian framework within which this difference can happen is itself never changing. So provocatively put, I became blasé by it. And so I began to think through how could you do anthropology differently? How could you do fieldwork differently? And then I recognized that this concept of ethnos actually is also a whole configuration of the human, where you literally have a human sphere on the left and a natural sphere on the right. And I began to write the history of that distinction and how one could think differently. And then I noticed that what interests me most in my work or in my kinds of fieldworks are instances, little scenes in everyday life, where something emerges or becomes discernible that I cannot subsume under these classical categories that anthropology has been writing with. Now, in my old-fashioned 19th century German philosophy education, these are philosophical moments because something new in the emphatic sense of the term emerges that you cannot subsume under old concepts, that you cannot tame with them. There is a new dynamic, something that is different. And I became very interested in capturing these new or different moments. So fieldwork became an opportunity to find what Deleuze and Guattari call the always new, something that you can never put to rest, that you cannot subject or ever tame with concepts. And as I'm an anthropologist, I love to do that with respect to the human. Now, what I noticed trying to develop this as my daily practice as a sort of philosophically inclined anthropologist is that the question concerning the human appears today largely in areas that are not concerned with the human at all, like in microbiome research, which is really about microbes, but precisely because I don't know where a human ends and its microbiome begins, and microbes are kind of a constitutive part of the human, that seemed exquisitely interesting. But the microbiome researchers don't attend to it because they're not trained to recognize the anthropological or philosophical stakes of their work. And I can do the same thing with AI. An AI engineer is concerned with a machine, but there are true philosophical questions there, or anthropological questions, but they're not trained to attend to that. So if I describe my work as a philosophically inclined field worker in everyday life, as focused on those events that escape, thereby break open, or undermine our established ways of thinking and doing, from philosophy to anthropology to critical theory. And then I look at Agnieszka's work, which is focused on instances where, in my language, something very similar happens, where it's sort of condensated. Then there is and then her work becomes visible as a kind of artistic investigation in terms of fieldwork or exposure to the world. And there can be a giant overlap between her work and mine, even though my work is much more word-based. I'm a writer at the end of the day. That's what I'm doing. Or actually now I'm also an administrator who builds institutions and venues where people like Agnieszka and myself can come together. But there is a significant overlap in the kinds of practice and sensibilities between my work as a field worker and her work as an artist.
What makes research artistic research?
So one of the concepts that I proposed to Tobias for this working group around AI at the Berggruen Institute is, I call it errorism. And it's related to my interest in how intelligence cannot really be reduced to logic, and there is always a form of surplus, just like in language, where we have a meaning and we have a surplus. Same happens with intelligence. And actually, a lot of progress is happening not in a planned and logical way, but sometimes to kind of unplanned and nonlinear jumps, and by accidents and errors and mistakes. And we can, for example, look at various scientific discoveries that happen through an error. A lot of medications were invented by accident. We're looking for one thing and we stumble on penicillin or Viagra or something else. And so, for example, already the idea of funding research in science has already benefited from a lot of funding bodies, especially in the European Union, looking at artistic research and how research cannot be teleological, because it's very difficult to precisely describe what we're looking for, because we may discover things by accident. And this is very similar to the ways in which artists work, that it's a question of conscious erring. It's some kind of serendipity. And so I've been trying to discuss within our group this concept of errorism that we should apply to methodology of also other disciplines, not outside of art and culture. And the way that I'm applying emergence and collective intelligence to the art production is precisely related to this idea of how we can produce emergent, unplanned, nonlinear forms in art and in culture in the same way that they emerge in nature and in society. So, for example, I've been very inspired by the research conducted at the Santa Fe Institute in the early 90s, where a new branch of science was developed called growing artificial societies. And these were agent-based models where algorithms were basically imitating the work of a society and a different phenomena emerging in society, where humans were kind of imagined as individual agents that are all different and that they have some kind of code that stands for sex, gender, background, financial, racial, and so on. And so various very complex operations could be performed, and it allowed for testing a lot of theories. But obviously these models, because they were algorithmic models, they were imperfect. And so in my own work, I've been recently conducting research in how we could merge these artificial societies and agent-based models with non-human intelligence, and was applying slime mold intelligence or bacterial intelligence or termite intelligence, and also the input of the multitude of the workers of the mechanical Turk. So I'm trying to kind of intuitively do some sort of hybrid operation, like to create crossovers between nature and culture, and between AI and microbiome studies and synthetic biology, because I think that we cannot consider any of these fields separately.
Just following up philosophically to what Agnieszka just said about intelligence and nature-culture hybrids, once you decouple intelligence from its exclusive link to the human, and you extend it to different kinds of things, from machines, actually kinds of machines, to slime molds, you can come up with a map of kinds of intelligences, because presumably there is no single general formulation of what intelligence is, like, the law of aerodynamics, and then you have planes and birds and insects and things like that. So there is probably no general concept of intelligence, but once you come up with a map of kinds of intelligences, then any form of distinction between the human realm or the artificial realm and the natural realm will become probably insufficient, and even the concept of hybridization might fail. Because when you speak about hybridization, then you ultimately hold on to the idea that there are two different kinds, the human or artificial kind and the natural kind, and that they kind of come together. But imagine there would be 50 different kinds, then the formal dualism would be insufficient, and you can begin the project of wondering how could one come up with a whole different kind of language for thinking about these things. And maybe that's one place where one can sort of make the human into a project again and discard the baggage that we've inherited from the 17th and the 18th century, like the distinction between nature and culture, and think radically different. So there is a philosophical invitation implicit in Agnieszka's work that I find maximally exciting, because it's right here that this project of making the human, or this effort of making the human into a project again, becomes discernible and visible.
The project of the human is ongoing, and so is this conversation. I feel like this is only a few spoonfuls from a lake or an ocean. But thank you both for joining me, and I look forward to keeping the conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank you.